In 1917, the Russian Empire collapsed amid hunger, strikes, and a state incapable of sustaining its population. That collapse opened an era in which Soviet civilians would live the unthinkable, a revolution that promised dignity, a war that would devour entire cities, and a power that, after surviving everything, would condition every aspect of daily life. During the Second World War, Soviet society found itself trapped between destruction and a state that demanded total resistance. In Leningrad, more than 1 million people died of hunger. 10 million were evacuated, along with factories dismantled and rebuilt in Siberia, and after the victory, many survivors were interrogated or sent to the Gulag for having lived under occupation or having seen the West. The post-war period brought no relief. The famine of 1946 struck ruined areas, deportations of minorities continued, and ideological surveillance intensified until Stalin's final days. In 1953, the crowd that came to see his body triggered a deadly stampede, a reflection of a country marked by decades of fear, dependence, and silence. This documentary reveals what real life was like in practice for civilians in the Soviet Union. 1917, the year Russia changed forever under Lenin. At the beginning of 1917, the Russian Empire was on the verge of collapse. Ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, a title that designated the absolute monarch of Russia since medieval times onward, derived from the word Caesar, the country had lived for more than 3 centuries under an autocracy that concentrated power in a single figure. While a small nobility controlled the land and the administration of the state, the peasant majority survived in precarious conditions. The First World War had worsened every tension. Between 1914 and 1917, more than 6 million Russian soldiers died or were taken prisoner. The railway system crumbled, agricultural production fell by more than 1/3, and in Petrograd, today's St. Petersburg and then the capital of the empire, queues for bread stretched for hours while factories closed due to lack of fuel. With trains paralyzed, coal scarce and bread rationed, daily life became a struggle to survive the winter. In that scenario of hardship and widespread discontent, hunger arrived before the revolution. When the winter of 1917 covered Petrograd with its grey mantle, the entire city seemed to surrender to exhaustion, and from dawn thousands of women queued in front of bakeries wrapped in blankets and scarves, waiting for bread that almost never came, while children sick with cold huddled in doorways. The air smelled of damp coal and fear. After 3 years of war, the imperial economy had sunk. Factories barely functioned, and domestic stoves were fed on broken furniture. People no longer spoke of politics or glory, but of surviving one more day, and in kitchens, flour mixed with sawdust was boiled, sugarless tea was drunk, and conversations always revolved around the same thing: how long that torment would last. The revolution, before it had a name, was an endless wait in the middle of the cold. On the 23rd of February 1917, International Women's Day, textile workers from the suburbs of Petrograd left their looms and took to the streets. They carried no banners or portraits of leaders. They only shouted one word: bread, and soon they were joined by metal workers from the Putilov factory, turning the protest into a clamor that swept through the entire city. The soldiers sent to disperse them hesitated, many lowered their rifles, and some even joined the crowd. 3 days later, the Petrograd army had disintegrated. The soldiers, mostly peasants dressed in rags, no longer wished to keep dying for a war they did not understand, and preferred to return home rather than shoot at those who shared their hunger. Tsar Nicholas II, isolated and without loyal followers, abdicated on the 2nd of March. 3 centuries of autocracy ended with a hurried signature in a snow-covered train carriage, and Russia awoke without a monarch, without a government, and without direction. The fall of the Tsar brought no relief, for bread remained scarce and the front continued to kill. In the cities, imperial portraits disappeared from the walls, but daily life barely changed, and in the villages, peasants, tired of waiting for reforms, seized the landlords' lands. In Petrograd, 2 powers began to dispute the country's fate. On one side, the Duma formed a provisional government dominated by liberals who promised political freedom and the continuation of the war against Germany. On the other, the Petrograd Soviet, an assembly of workers and soldiers, demanded immediate peace and workers' control of the factories. The result was a state with 2 competing legitimacies: a government with legal authority but no strength, and a Soviet with strength, but no intention of governing, leaving the ordinary citizen trapped between hope and uncertainty, wondering who would decide whether there would be bread the next day. The soldiers received Order Number 1 from the Soviet, which allowed them to elect committees in their units and to obey only those orders that did not contradict the Soviets, thereby destroying what remained of discipline. On the fronts, officers were challenged or abandoned, and the trenches emptied because the men, exhausted, returned to their villages. In the countryside, women were left alone to sow and harvest without tools, and children learned to bury the dead. In the cities, queues grew and rumors multiplied, and the winter of 1917 became a succession of grey days when the revolution still had no shape, but the old order had already disappeared forever. In April, a sealed train crossed Europe and deposited in Petrograd a man who would change the course of history, Lenin, who arrived from exile with a simple and devastating plan: to stop the war, to hand the land to the peasants, and to transfer all power to the Soviets. His April theses struck like lightning in an exhausted country. Workers listened to his speeches while hungry, and peasants saw in his words the promise that no one would come to requisition their grain anymore. Meanwhile, in the factories, workers' committees began making decisions on their own, and in the villages, peasants stopped waiting for authorization to seize the lands. In that chaos, the authority of the state dissolved. But for civilians, the revolution was, above all, a matter of survival, not of ideology, but of bread, peace, and rest. During the summer of 1917, the streets of Petrograd lived between euphoria and fear. The city was filled with demobilized soldiers, unemployed workers, and lost peasants searching for food, and in July a spontaneous revolt broke out to which the provisional government responded with repression. Lenin fled to Finland, and for a moment it seemed the Bolsheviks were finished. However, in August, the attempted coup by General Kornilov, who sought to restore order by force, changed everything. Workers sabotaged the trains, soldiers refused to fight, and the threat of reaction pushed the masses toward the Bolsheviks. When autumn arrived, the provisional government was exhausted, and the people, determined to end the war and hunger, looked to Lenin as their last hope. On the night of the 24th to the 25th of October 1917, groups of Red Guards, formed by armed workers, occupied stations, bridges, and public buildings. The streets were calm, restaurants remained open, and theatres continued their performances, and while diners ate supper, power changed hands. The assault on the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was still in session, was brief and almost bloodless. And when dawn broke, Russia had a new government, the Council of People's Commissars, chaired by Lenin. The people awaited the end of suffering, but the revolution was only beginning, and civilians would soon discover that the price of hope would be immense. The new government decreed peace and the nationalization of the land. Millions of peasants finally felt owners of what they worked, but the war with Germany had not yet ended, and the Russian army was already a shadow. In March 1918, Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ceded vast territories in exchange for ending the war, an act of survival, not of victory. While leaders argued over borders, peasants silently buried their dead, and in the cities the economy collapsed. Money lost its value, trade was banned, and the state imposed so-called war communism, a system of forced requisitions and total control of production. Peasants had to surrender their grain under penalty of death, workers received wages in food or promises, houses grew cold, factories stopped, and families lived by the light of a single candle. Between 1918 and 1921, Russia became a country of ghosts. The Civil War pitted the Red Army against the White Armies, supported by foreign powers, but for civilians the flags mattered little. What really counted was which side was requisitioning the grain that week. In the villages of the Volga or the Don, peasants hid in the forests when soldiers arrived, whether red or white, and harvests were burned while villages changed hands again and again, erasing the boundary between revolution and revenge. In the cities, trams stopped running, hospitals ran out of medicine, and children died of typhus. Moscow lost half its population and Petrograd 2/3. Workers fled to the countryside to survive, and the working class that had made the revolution practically disappeared. In 1920, the Civil War came to an end. The Whites were defeated, the Tsarist generals fled into exile, and the Bolsheviks remained alone facing a destroyed country. Victory brought no relief, for agricultural production was barely one-third of that of 1913, industry was paralyzed, and millions had died. The survivors wandered through an immense territory where the revolution had left behind ruins, hunger and disillusionment, and the peasants, fed up with requisitions, began to rebel. In Tambov province, the former socialist Alexander Antonov led a peasant uprising that lasted for months. The rebels did not demand the return of the Tsar, they simply asked to be left to farm in peace. In Petrograd, workers went on strike and the government responded with arrests, while tension reached its peak in March 1921, when the sailors of Kronstadt, the very ones who had been the pride of the revolution, rose up against the regime demanding free Soviets and an end to terror. Lenin called them counter-revolutionaries and ordered the revolt crushed. For 3 days, troops crossed the ice under machine gun fire, and when the base was taken, thousands of sailors were shot or sent to labor camps. The revolution, which had begun in the name of the people, had learned to fear them. Lenin then understood that the country could no longer hold out any longer. At the 10th Congress of the party, held while the Kronstadt rebellion was being crushed, he announced the end of war communism and the beginning of the new economic policy, or NEP, a tactical retreat intended to save the economy. Requisitions were replaced by a tax in kind, peasants were allowed to sell their surpluses, and small businesses reopened. Slowly, life returned. In the markets of Moscow and Petrogrado, women sold black bread, vegetables and fabrics, and children once again heard music in the streets. Factories resumed their activity, though with low wages, and shops displayed goods that had not been seen for years. Money regained value, and with it, inequality and resentment also returned. The new merchants, known as netmen, grew rich quickly. In the big cities, luxury cafes and restaurants reopened their doors, and there the new rich gathered while the workers continued to live in damp basements. The old aristocratic mansions were turned into communal apartments where several families shared the same kitchen and the same bathroom. On the walls, portraits of saints were replaced by images of Lenin, and children learned at school that the past was an enemy. Even so, many felt that life was finally beginning to return to normal. In the countryside, the peasants worked without fear of requisitions, and although taxes were high, at least they could keep something of their harvest. In the cities, the theatres reopened, the trams began running again, and people regained the habit of strolling on Sundays. However, the NEP brought with it new tensions. The younger communists, shaped by war and sacrifice, looked with disgust at the resurgence of trade and private wealth, for they felt that the revolution had been made to eliminate inequality and not to tolerate it. Lenin knew this, but he also understood that without economic concessions the regime would not survive. In the party committees they spoke of pragmatism, but in the streets the talk was of injustice. People still remembered the years of hunger, the shootings and the losses. Many had survived, but few knew what for. In 1922, Lenin suffered his first stroke. From then on, his presence in political life was intermittent and his figure began to turn into myth. From his desk, he dictated notes to his secretaries in a halting voice, worried about the country's direction, and in his last writings he criticized the growth of bureaucracy and the excessive power of his general secretary, Joseph Stalin. In December of 1922, he wrote his political testament, in which he warned that Stalin was too rude and should be removed, but his words went unheeded, and the party decided to hide the document after his death. Lenin died on the 21st of January of 1924. His body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum in Red Square, where crowds came to bid him farewell in silence. Peasants arrived from distant villages with offerings of bread and dried flowers, and workers queued for hours to see him one last time. Many wept, and others simply looked on in disbelief. For the Soviet people, Lenin was more than a leader. He was the embodiment of the promise of a just world that never materialized. He had brought peace, but after a civil war, he had given land, but at the cost of millions of lives. He had promised bread, but hunger still haunted the villages. After Lenin's death, everyday life regained a certain stability, but the country was moving towards a silent change. The NEP reactivated the markets and allowed agricultural production to return almost to pre-war levels, although the imbalance between industrial and agricultural prices generated growing tensions. Inside the party, Stalin used those years to consolidate a power that the population barely noticed. He controlled regional appointments, sidelined Trotsky, and turned local committees into extensions of the central leadership. By 1927, the supply crisis revealed the limits of the system and the peasants' resistance to handing over grain, especially in Ukraine and the Volga. The cities again experienced shortages, and the leadership concluded that the country could not sustain itself with a semi-private economy. In that climate of uncertainty, Stalin pushed for the end of the NEP and prepared a radical turn that promised modernization, but which would soon impose an unprecedented coercive transformation. Stalin transforms the USSR, forced industrialization, mass famine, and absolute terror. In 1929, the Soviet Union was completely transformed. The images of smiling peasants that decorated the walls of Moscow and Leningrad gave way to hardened faces of workers wielding hammers against a horizon of chimneys, and the slogans no longer spoke of the land or the harvest, but of steel, electricity, and machines. Stalin had proclaimed that the country had to catch up with and overtake the West in 1 decade, a leap that had taken other nations a century. The new economic policy, with its brief tolerance of small trade and peasant property, was declared obsolete. In its place, an unprecedented experiment was imposed: the total transformation of the economy and of everyday life under the absolute direction of the state. For millions of Soviets, building socialism ceased to be a voluntary ideal and became an incessant mobilization in which disobedience amounted to treason and survival depended on silence. The first great blow fell upon the countryside. The Bolsheviks had always regarded the peasantry with suspicion, considering it an obstacle to socialism. After the Civil War, peasants had been allowed to work the land as if it were their own, but by the end of the 1920s, the government desperately needed grain to feed the cities, to export it and thus pay for foreign machinery, and to sustain the industrial drive that was to turn the USSR into a modern power. The most prosperous peasants, the so-called kulaks, refused to sell their produce at the almost symbolic official prices, and in the autumn of 1929, Stalin decided to put an end to that defiance by declaring war on the countryside. Teams of activists, urban workers, and political police agents burst into the villages to enforce collectivization by force. Private farms were to be transformed into kolkhozes, state-controlled agricultural cooperatives. The process was violent and chaotic. Local officials were given quotas of families who had to join the kolkhozes and often exceeded them out of fear or ambition. Those who resisted were labeled kulaks and deported to internal exile, especially to Siberia and the European North, where thousands perished from hunger and cold. Between 1929 and 1933, around 5 million people were driven from their homes. Those who remained saw their animals, tools, and land confiscated, and many peasants preferred to slaughter their livestock rather than hand it over. Half the country's cattle disappeared in a few years, a blow that would mark Soviet agriculture for decades. The result was catastrophe. As grain requisitions increased, hunger spread like a shadow. The 1932 harvest was poor, yet the state demanded the same quotas. Confiscation teams took not only the surplus, but also the seed for the next planting. In the most fertile regions, Ukraine, the North Caucasus, the Lower Volga, villages were left empty of food. People ate grass, bark, domestic animals, and in the testimonies of survivors, the horror takes shape. Abandoned children wandering through the fields, mothers hiding the death of their children to keep a ration. Entire villages wiped out without burials. Between 5 and 7 million people died in the famine of 1932 to 1933, known in Ukraine called the Holodomor, while the regime denied its existence and continued exporting grain. For the Soviet peasantry, collectivization meant the end of their world and the beginning of fear as the norm. While the countryside was being emptied, the cities grew at dizzying speed. In the same year that collectivization began, Stalin launched the first 5-year plan, an unprecedented industrial race that promised to double production in 5 years. The targets were impossible, but they were imposed as ideological commandments. Across the Soviet Union factories, dams and metallurgical complexes rose amid improvisation and fervor. The city of Magnitogorsk in the Urals became the emblem of that construction fever, a gigantic steel complex born from mud and cold, built by tens of thousands of workers who lived in unheated barracks and worked 14-hour shifts. Propaganda cameras showed smiling heroes, but in reality exhaustion, injuries and disorganization were the daily bread. Even so, the message was clear: industrialization had to advance at any cost, even if the cost was human. A large part of those new workers were peasants driven out by hunger. They arrived without technical training or factory habits, and the cultural shock was brutal. Labor discipline was weak. Many abandoned their posts in search of better conditions or simply to survive. In some Donbass mines, 1 in every 4 workers deserted each month. To contain the chaos, the state tightened sanctions. Lateness, absences, or technical errors were punished by loss of the ration card, and in serious cases, by prison. Little by little, the line between work and punishment blurred, and the rules hardened until labor offenses became crimes. The enthusiasm that propaganda tried to awaken was replaced by fear and necessity. Even so, the regime tried to combine coercion with exaltation. In 1935, the Stakhanovite movement emerged, celebrating workers who exemplarily exceeded production quotas. Alexei Stakhanov, a Donbass miner, was presented as the symbol of the new Soviet worker after extracting 14 times more coal than planned. In reality, several comrades had done part of the work, but the story served the regime's purpose to show that unlimited effort was possible. The faces of the heroes of socialist labor flooded posters and newsreels, while production targets rose for everyone. The result was the opposite of what was intended: tension among workers, unfair competition, improvisation, and exhaustion. Nevertheless, production grew, and although official figures exaggerated the achievements, the Soviet Union was emerging as an industrial power. The cost, invisible in the reports, was measured in worn-out lives, accidents, and a population subjected to an inhuman pace. Urban life in the 1930s mixed pride with hardship. Families lived crammed into the kommunalki, the communal apartments where several households shared a single kitchen and bathroom. Privacy was almost impossible. Thin walls let conversations and arguments pass through, and any word could be misinterpreted. Queues in front of shops were part of the daily landscape, and rationing, although officially abolished in 1935, returned every time basic goods ran short. Women bore a double burden. They worked in factories or offices for long hours and then took on housework and child-rearing. The state celebrated their entry into the workforce as a sign of equality, but it provided neither enough nurseries nor support. By 1937, more than half of the agricultural workforce and almost 40% of the industrial workforce were women, though few reached positions of responsibility. At the same time, the regime changed its moral discourse. The sexual freedom policies of the 1920s were replaced by a return to conservatism. Motherhood was exalted, abortion was banned except when life was at risk, and homosexuality was criminalized. The family, previously branded a bourgeois institution, came to be regarded as the moral core of socialism. Stalin saw family stability as a reflection of the discipline he wanted for the country: obedience, sacrifice, and continuity. Films showed heroic mothers and exemplary worker fathers, and official campaigns rewarded large families and condemned divorce. The revolution that had promised to free the individual from the past ended up imposing upon him a new code of traditional virtues. Upon this already exhausted society fell the terror. Between 1936 and 1938, the Great Purge destroyed the last remnants of personal security. The Great Moscow Trials, broadcast as public spectacles, showed former companions of Lenin confessing to impossible conspiracies. But beyond those famous figures, millions of anonymous citizens were swept up by the repressive machine. A misunderstood remark, a neighbor's denunciation, or a distant contact with someone suspicious was enough to be arrested. The NKVD, predecessor of the KGB, operated by quotas. Each region had to deliver a fixed number of enemies of the people. Arrests usually happened at night, and footsteps in the corridor followed by a knock on the door were enough to paralyze an entire building with fear. Those taken away rarely returned. Relatives were stigmatized, children were sent to state orphanages, and homes were reassigned to new occupants. Terror permeated every space of life. In factories, accidents were interpreted as sabotage. In schools, children were taught to distrust their own parents if they heard criticism of the government. And in the communalki, people spoke in whispers for fear that someone was listening behind the wall. Informing became a form of survival. Many denounced others before they themselves were denounced, hoping to save themselves or even gain promotion. Loyalty was measured in visible gestures, attending rallies, applauding enthusiastically, signing collective letters condemning alleged traitors. Indifference was suspicious, and fear became second nature, an atmosphere that enveloped everyone equally. When the purge began to subside in 1938, the Soviet Union was an unrecognizable country. It had achieved an industrial capacity that placed it among the great powers, with new cities, colossal dams, and millions of literate workers. But that power had been built upon a land of absences, empty villages, nameless cemeteries, and an entire generation scarred by fear. More than 1 million people had been executed or sent to the Gulag. The Red Army had lost much of its command, and trust among comrades themselves had turned into suspicion. On the surface, the country stood firm, with its factories running and trains carrying steel from one end to the other, but beneath that disciplined exterior lingered a dense silence made of caution and exhaustion. On the edges of that apparent calm, something was beginning to stir beyond the borders, a threat that would soon put to the test everything the regime had built. The Soviet Union faces the brutal invasion by Nazi Germany. On the 23rd of August of 1939, in the Great Kremlin Palace, Molotov and Ribbentrop signed a non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany that shook the foundations of the world. Stalin, who for years had built his legitimacy on hatred of fascism, that night toasted the health of the Führer, beloved by the German people, while Ribbentrop declared that he felt as if he were among comrades. For millions of Soviets raised on anti-Nazi propaganda, this was incomprehensible, but Stalin had coldly calculated that war was inevitable, and that the best course was to let it break out among others while the Soviet Union bought time. The pact included a secret protocol that divided Eastern Europe like a cake. Poland would be split, the Baltic states, Bessarabia and part of Finland would fall under Soviet influence, and both powers pledged not to interfere in each other's conquests. 9 days later, on the 1st of September, Hitler invaded Poland from the west, and on the 17th of September, the Red Army crossed the eastern Polish border to claim its share of the spoils. The Second World War had begun, but the Soviet Union remained on the sidelines, feeding the illusion that it could stay out of the conflict while capitalism and fascism destroyed each other in a war of attrition that Stalin watched from a distance with calculated indifference. For almost 2 years, the Soviets lived in a strange armed peace, where factories kept producing, families raised their children, and official propaganda presented Germany as a respectable commercial partner, not as an existential threat. Theaters stopped showing anti-Nazi films, and Wagner's works were performed with full solemnity at the Bolshoi Theatre, while the common border with Germany, established after the fall of Poland, filled with trains carrying oil, grain and raw materials toward the Reich in exchange for blueprints of military machinery and promises that were never fully honored. Stalin feared provoking Hitler and scrupulously fulfilled the terms of the agreement. But in the autumn of 1940, the Soviet intelligence services began receiving increasingly alarming reports. German troops were massing on the border. Reconnaissance aircraft flew over Soviet territory with impunity, and from Tokyo, the agent Richard Sorge sent precise data about an imminent invasion, including the exact date and the number of divisions. Stalin dismissed all the warnings because he considered it unthinkable that Hitler would open a second front before defeating Great Britain. And in that fatal miscalculation, the safety of millions of people who trusted that the regime knew what it was doing was lost. On the 22nd of June of 1941, at 4:15 in the morning, 4.5 million German soldiers, accompanied by Finnish, Romanian and Hungarian troops, crossed the Soviet border along a front of more than 3,000 kilometers, unleashing Operation Barbarossa, the largest land attack in history. In the first hours, 1,200 Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground without having taken off, communications collapsed, and Red Army units, deployed close to the border without deep defense plans, were surrounded and annihilated before they could react. Stalin, paralyzed by shock and disbelief, shut himself away in his dacha for days while the country bled, And it was not he who announced the war to the Soviet people, but Molotov, with a trembling voice 8 hours after the invasion, saying only that the enemy would be defeated even though no one knew how. For civilians, the war arrived in the form of explosions, screams and uncontrollable panic. In border cities such as Minsk, Riga and Lvov, bombs fell on markets, train stations and residential buildings, and families fled eastward with whatever they could carry: blankets, photographs, some food, crowding onto packed trains or walking for weeks along dusty roads, pursued by columns of smoke and the roar of German Stukas. While in the villages, peasants watched the refugees pass with suspicion and fear, knowing they would be next. The evacuation was one of the most impressive and heartbreaking feats of the war, because between June and December of 1941, the Soviet government managed to move 10 million people and more than 1,500 complete factories eastward. The plants were dismantled piece by piece, loaded onto freight trains and sent beyond the Urals, to Siberia, to Central Asia Central, where the workers who traveled with the machines rebuilt them in the middle of the steppe, under open skies, without roofs or heating, working shifts of 12 or 14 hours in the depths of the Siberian winter to set up lathes, foundries and tank assembly lines. Women massively replaced the men mobilized to the front, coming to make up in 1942 more than 40% of the industrial workforce and more than half in the countryside, while 12-year-old children operated lathes and old people loaded coal, with no possible exceptions. The already draconian labor code of 1940 was hardened still further, until leaving one's post was treated as desertion punished by forced labor, and the line between free work and slavery disappeared completely under the pressure of total mobilization that consumed human lives like fuel. Meanwhile, in the occupied territories a different hell began, because the Germans advanced at terrifying speed, taking Kiev in September and reaching the outskirts of Moscow in October. And as they advanced, they imposed a regime of racial terror that considered Slavs subhuman, destined for slavery or extinction. While Jews were exterminated immediately by special SS squads, the Einsatzgruppen, who followed the regular troops, shooting communists, intellectuals and Jews into mass graves, murdering 500,000 people in a few months and exceeding 1 million by the end of the war. The Germans also executed captured political commissars, burned entire villages in reprisal for partisan attacks, and sent millions of men and women as forced laborers to Germany, leaving the civilian population trapped between the ruthless and racist German army and the Soviet regime, which considered anyone who had lived under occupation to be suspect. Even so, the occupation was not uniform, because in the Baltic states, Western Ukraine and Bessarabia, territories forcibly incorporated between 1939 and 1941, many welcomed the Germans as liberators, remembering the mass deportations, summary executions and brutal collectivization imposed by the Soviets only months earlier, and some collaborated actively by forming auxiliary militias, serving as local police and denouncing Jews and communists. However, the Nazis squandered that opportunity with their systematic brutality, their open contempt for Slavs and their scorched earth policy, which alienated even those willing to collaborate, since they kept the kolkhozes without offering anything in return, neither autonomy nor land nor hope, and thus, little by little, resistance grew. The partisan movement was chaotic at first, organized by Red Army soldiers trapped behind enemy lines, deserters, local communists, and desperate peasants who operated from the forests, blowing up bridges, sabotaging trains, attacking German convoys, and executing collaborators, while the Soviet regime supported them by sending weapons, propaganda, and agitators by air. The partisans distributed leaflets promising the defeat of fascism, and in some cases hinting at future reforms such as the dissolution of the kolkhozes and greater religious freedom, although it is not clear whether these promises were authorized from Moscow or were local initiatives. What is certain is that they kept hope alive among the population. The Germans responded with brutal reprisals, shooting 10 civilians for every German soldier killed and burning entire villages with their inhabitants inside. But German terror only fueled more resistance, since Nazi brutality had destroyed any possibility of peaceful coexistence and turned the war into a struggle of mutual extermination. While this was happening in the occupied territories, the home front organized itself for survival, because in the cities of the interior, everyday life was reduced to working, sleeping and searching for food under a ration card system that provided minimal rations, causing queues to stretch for hours to obtain black bread. the basic food, while meat and milk became unattainable luxuries. Families burned furniture to keep warm in winter. Children went out to collect scrap metal for the factories. Hospitals filled with wounded evacuated from the front who were treated by teenage nurses with insufficient anesthesia, and the whole country operated under the principle of total mobilization, where every resource, every hour of work, and every calorie of food was destined exclusively for the war, without mercy or exceptions. The siege of Leningrad was the most terrible symbol of civilian suffering, since in September of 1941 the German army surrounded the city and cut all land connections, and Hitler decided not to storm it but to surrender it by starvation, in what became a nightmare lasting 2.5 years. The population, which exceeded 3 million inhabitants, was trapped, and since a long siege had not been foreseen, food reserves were quickly exhausted, until in November the daily bread ration for factory workers was 250 grams, and for dependents, office workers and children under 12 years old, barely 125 grams, with no other food available. People ate dead birds, dogs, cats, soup made from ground bones and glue, and when Lake Ladoga froze, a supply route was opened across the ice, constantly bombed by the Germans, through which some food entered and evacuees left, although it was not enough to prevent more than 500,000 people from dying of hunger and cold during the first winter alone. Corpses piled up in the streets because there was no strength left to bury them, and there were documented cases of cannibalism, yet the city held out, with factories continuing to produce ammunition, and the Leningrad Symphony Orchestra premiering Shostakovich's 7th Symphony in August of 1942, in the middle of the siege, before a half-empty but defiant hall. When the siege was finally broken in January of 1944, more than 1 million civilians had died, and the survivors were skeletal, traumatized, but alive and proud of having withstood the impossible. On the military front, the Red Army fought with a mixture of heroism, disorganization and brutality, inasmuch as the soldiers fought for the motherland, not for communism, motivated by official propaganda that had abandoned revolutionary language to embrace the most traditional Russian patriotism. Stalin addressed the people as brothers and sisters, not as comrades. Newspapers exalted the great Tsarist generals such as Suvorov, Kutuzov and Alexander Nevsky, and the Orthodox Church, persecuted for decades, was partially rehabilitated with the reopening of temples and the printing of Bibles, while religious leaders blessed the war effort. All this had a calculated purpose: to unite the people under any banner available, and it worked, since millions of Soviets fought with fierce determination, not out of love for Stalin, but out of hatred for the invader, and to defend their land with the certainty that there was no possible alternative. The Battle of Moscow, in December of 1941, was the first major Soviet victory after months of catastrophic retreats, when the Red Army managed to halt the German advance at the gates of the capital and launch a counter-offensive that pushed the invaders 100 kilometers to the west, inflicting the first significant defeat on the Wehrmacht since the beginning of the war. The civilians of Moscow, who had dug trenches on the outskirts and seen the government evacuate offices to Kuibyshev, felt immense relief. But the war was only just beginning, because in 1942 the Germans launched a new offensive in the south toward the Caucasus oil fields, reaching Stalingrad in August. An industrial city on the banks of the Volga, where one of the bloodiest battles in history would be fought. Stalingrad was not just a military battle, but an urban hell where every building, every basement and every pile of rubble became a battlefield, and the civilians who failed to evacuate were trapped in the crossfire, living in flooded cellars, eating rats and dying crushed by bombs or stray bullets, while the 62nd Soviet Army, under the command of General Chuikov, defended the city street by street, building by building, for endless months. In November, when the Germans controlled almost the entire city, the Red Army launched a massive encirclement operation that surrounded the German Sixth Army, and although Hitler forbade retreat, in February of 1943, Field Marshal von Paulus surrendered along with 90,000 starving and frozen soldiers, marking the Soviet victory at Stalingrad as the definitive turning point of the war, after which the Red Army advanced almost without pause toward the west. But the cost was monstrous, for between soldiers and civilians the Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people during the war, leaving entire cities reduced to rubble, villages that disappeared from the map, and entire generations of young men dead, with women left widowed en masse, children orphaned, and the ratio of women to men reaching in some regions 3-to-1, shattering the country's demographic structure forever. In addition to the physical suffering, the war left deep psychological scars on the soldiers who returned from the front, having witnessed indescribable horrors, and on the families who survived the siege or the occupation, carrying traumas they could never express, since the regime did not allow talk of weakness and Soviet propaganda celebrated heroism without leaving room for mourning. As the Red Army advanced westward, liberating occupied territories, another kind of repression began because Stalin distrusted anyone who had lived under German control, and Soviet prisoners of war who managed to escape or were liberated were interrogated by the NKVD and often sent straight to labor camps, while civilians who had collaborated or simply survived in occupied areas were considered suspect. Entire villages of ethnic minorities were deported en masse. The Volga Germans in 1941, Crimean Tatars in 1944, Chechens, Ingush, Kalmyks, regardless of whether they had collaborated or not, because all were guilty simply for belonging to an ethnicity regarded as traitorous, and hundreds of thousands died during the deportations or in the places of exile. This brutality, carried out in the middle of the war against the Nazis, showed that the Stalinist regime had not changed and that the external enemy had been fought while the internal terror never stopped. In May of 1945, the Red Army took Berlin. Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the ruins of the Reichstag. Hitler committed suicide, and Germany surrendered, ending the war in Europe. The celebrations in Moscow, Leningrad, and other cities were massive. People wept with relief, hugged strangers, and drank until they collapsed because they had won and they had survived. But when the initial euphoria passed, the country awoke to a devastating reality of millions dead, millions maimed, millions orphaned, entire cities reduced to ruins, civilian industry destroyed, fields ravaged, families broken, and above all that the same regime that had taken them to the brink of the abyss before the war remained in power, intact and implacable. Soviet civilians had paid the highest price of the war, working to exhaustion, going hungry, burying their children and enduring brutal occupations, defending their land not because they loved the Soviet system, but because the enemy gave them no other choice. Victory gave them a reason for pride and a national narrative that the regime would exploit for decades, but it also left them with a wound that never fully closed, because they had defeated fascism only to return to a country governed by fear, censorship and repression. The peace that arrived in 1945 was not freedom, but only the end of the gunfire, and the silence that followed was the silence of those defeated twice over, by the war and by their own state. The Soviet veterans who defeated Hitler and ended up in the gulags. On the 9th of May of 1945, Moscow awoke under red flags. The bells rang, crowds filled Red Square, and the loudspeakers announced what everyone had been waiting for. Germany had surrendered. The war, the most destructive humanity had ever known, was over, and the Soviets had paid the highest price for victory. That day there were embraces, tears and vodka shared among strangers, exhausted soldiers returning home, hoping to find their families, their villages, a normal life. But when the initial euphoria faded, the country awoke to a reality that many had feared but no one dared name. 27 million dead, cities reduced to rubble, fields laid waste, and above all, the same regime that had brought them to the edge of the abyss before the war still stood, intact, watchful. Victory had come, but freedom had not, and the winter that followed was long, cold and silent. The reconstruction began immediately, but without the necessary resources and without any compassion for those who had to carry it out. Leningrad, Kiev, Stalingrad and Minsk were mountains of ruins where families searched among the rubble for something to salvage, a photograph, a piece of furniture, a memory that proved the previous life had existed. 25 million people had lost their homes and were living in makeshift barracks, damp basements or collective shelters without heating or running water, while in the villages burned by the Germans, reconstruction proceeded slowly with rotten wood and mud, without electricity or tools. Labor was scarce because millions of young men had died at the front, and those who returned found a country that distrusted them more than it celebrated them. Hunger settled in again as a daily norm because agricultural production in 1945 was barely 60% of what it had been before the war, and in 1946, after devastating droughts, it fell to little more than one-third. Instead of organizing humanitarian aid, the regime concealed the existence of the famine, continued with compulsory grain requisitions, and even exported food while its population died of starvation. Ukraine was hit with special harshness, and Nikita Khrushchev, then secretary of the Communist Party in the region, years later described scenes that defied the imagination. People driven mad by hunger who resorted to cannibalism, corpses in the streets with the flesh gnawed from their bones, mothers losing their minds beside the bodies of their children. Khrushchev asked Stalin for help, but he was ignored because admitting the famine would have meant acknowledging that the Soviet Union, victorious superpower, could not feed its own people. Thus the tragedy was hidden, the victims were not counted, and the propaganda continued to speak of a brilliant future while families shared rations of black bread and watery soup. War veterans faced a bitter return because the regime distrusted anyone who had had contact with foreigners. The soldiers who had seen Europe, its intact cities, well-stocked shops, its higher standard of living, represented an ideological threat more dangerous than any weapon. They could compare, and the comparison did not favor the Soviet system. So prisoners of war released from German camps were subjected to exhaustive interrogations by the NKVD, the political police, and many were sent directly to the Gulag, the vast system of forced labor camps that Stalin had kept active even during the war. They were accused of treason for having surrendered, even though surrender had been inevitable, and hundreds of thousands of men who had survived the Nazi hell ended their days in the Soviet hell of Siberia or the Arctic, working in mines, logging or pharaonic projects under conditions that killed slowly. The Gulag population grew again to figures the regime would never publish. Mass deportations did not cease with victory either, because the ethnic minorities that Stalin had accused of collaborating with the Nazis, Volga Germans, Crimean Tatars, Chechens, Ingush and Kalmyks, were not allowed to return to their lands and lived in forced exile in Central Asia, where they died of disease, hunger and abandonment. In the newly reconquered Western territories, the Baltic states, Western Ukraine, Bessarabia, collectivization was imposed with the same brutality as in the 1930s, and peasants who resisted were deported or shot while guerrilla groups continued fighting Soviet troops years after the official end of the war. Victory over fascism did not bring peace inside the country, but a continuation of terror under the guise of patriotic reconstruction. Everyday life in the cities was marked by permanent shortage and omnipresent control. Ration cards, briefly abolished in 1947 as propaganda of normality, reappeared in practice when basic goods remained unavailable. Queues stretched for hours and communal apartments, the kommunalki, remained the reality for millions. Several families sharing one apartment, one kitchen, one bathroom, with no privacy at all. Overcrowding was such that in some rooms there was no space for beds, and people slept on mattresses on the floor, while in 1955 the average living space per person was only 5 square meters, less than before the First World War. Women, who had worked in factories during the war, continued working because a single salary was not enough to support a family. But now they also had to carry out domestic chores, raise the children, stand in endless shopping queues and attend compulsory political activism, where enthusiasm was monitored. The regime intensified ideological surveillance with a campaign known as the Zhdanovshchina, named after Andrei Zhdanov, the Politburo member responsible for ideology, who between 1946 and 1948 issued a series of decrees attacking writers, filmmakers, musicians and scientists accused of ideological deviations. The poet Anna Akhmatova and the writer Mikhail Zoshchenko were publicly denounced, expelled from the Writers' Union and condemned to ostracism, while their works disappeared from libraries. Filmmakers saw their films censored or destroyed until film production fell to only 4 or 5 movies per year, all of them propaganda in which the characters were flat archetypes. Musicians, including Prokofiev and Shostakovich, were accused of formalism for composing music that the ordinary citizen could not hum. Science did not escape either. Genetics was declared a bourgeois science and its defenders persecuted, while Trofim Lysenko, an officially backed charlatan, imposed pseudo-scientific theories that would set Soviet biology back by decades. Anti-Semitism became open and official in Stalin's final years because the dictator distrusted Jews, especially after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, fearing divided loyalties. The members of the Jewish anti-fascist committee were arrested and executed, and in 1953, shortly before his death, Stalin orchestrated the so-called doctors' plot, accusing a group of doctors, almost all Jewish, of attempting to poison senior government officials in what appeared to be the prelude to a massive purge. Jews were expelled from universities, scientific institutions, and government positions, and the country seemed on the verge of a new outbreak of state-orchestrated ethnic violence. Meanwhile, the cult of Stalin reached religious proportions. His image was everywhere, and his name was mentioned in every speech, every news report, every school lesson as an obligatory mantra. He was credited with intellectual and military miracles he had never performed, and writers described him as father of the people, genius of humanity, savior of the fatherland. The propaganda was so omnipresent that many Soviets, especially the younger ones, genuinely believed in the leader's greatness, while others kept silent because they knew a single wrong word could cost them their lives. Stalin lived in seclusion at his dacha, increasingly paranoid, distrusting even his closest collaborators. His final years were marked by internal purges. Zhdanov died under suspicious circumstances in 1948, and his followers were executed in the so-called Leningrad affair. Molotov saw his wife arrested, and Beria, the head of the secret police, knew that his own execution could come at any moment. On the 5th of March of 1953, Stalin died of a cerebral hemorrhage at his dacha, surrounded by terrified subordinates who had wasted precious hours too afraid to enter his room. Officially, the country plunged into mourning. Crowds wept in the streets, loudspeakers played funeral music, and newspapers were printed with black borders. But beneath the official grief, there was a contained relief, a collective sigh that no one dared voice aloud. People did not know what would come next, but they knew something had to change because they had survived the war, the famine, the terror. They had rebuilt cities with their own hands and buried their dead in silence. Now, with the tyrant dead, the country entered a period of uncertainty where fear mingled with a timid hope that no one dared to name. The winter of the victors had been long and brutal, but for the first time in decades, spring seemed possible. From Khrushchev to Gorbachev, the slow and painful twilight of the Soviet Empire. On the 5th of March of 1953, when Soviet radio announced Stalin's death, millions of people wept in the streets without quite knowing why. Some wept out of fear because they could not imagine a world without the leader who had dominated their lives for 30 years. Others wept with relief because they knew the most brutal terror had just ended. And many wept because they did not know what would come next. For days, Moscow sank into hysterical mourning. Crowds tried to see the dictator's body, and hundreds were crushed to death in Red Square. But when the initial shock passed and the flag stopped flying at half-mast, the country awoke to a strange reality. Stalin was dead, but the system he had built remained standing, and no one knew how to live in a Soviet Union without Stalin. The years that followed were a rehearsal for normality. Nikita Khrushchev, the new leader, was coarse, impulsive, and very different from the dictator who had preceded him. In 1956, during the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, he delivered a secret speech that shook the foundations of the Soviet state. For 4 hours, he denounced Stalin's crimes, the purges, the personality cult, the historical falsifications, the boundless brutality. The speech was not officially published in the Soviet Union until 1989, but everyone knew it. It was discussed in party meetings, whispered in factories, read in low voices in communal apartments. For the first time in decades, people were allowed to say aloud what many had thought in silence. Stalin had been a criminal. Thousands of political prisoners returned from the gulags, skeletal and traumatized, searching for families that sometimes no longer existed. Their stories circulated in private conversations, never in public, because although fear had lessened, surveillance had not disappeared. Khrushchev's thaw awakened hopes. Censorship was partially relaxed, and some writers dared to publish works that would previously have meant immediate arrest. Alexander Solzhenitsyn managed to publish One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, a novel about the labor camps that moved everyone who read it. Filmmakers made less propagandistic movies, musicians played jazz without being accused of treason, and scientists gained some freedom to research without constant oversight. But the enthusiasm was short-lived. In 1964, Khrushchev was removed by his own comrades, tired of his failed experiments, erratic reforms, and unpredictable personality. He was sent into forced retirement, and the country entered a new era, that of Leonid Brezhnev, a grey bureaucrat who promised stability and delivered stagnation. The Brezhnev years, which lasted until 1982, were the longest and greyest in late Soviet history. Mass terror had ended, but in its place came something worse: apathy. People stopped believing in communism as a utopian project and learned to survive in a system that no longer inspired either fear or hope. Propaganda was still everywhere: posters, newspapers, televised speeches, but no one took it seriously. Soviet citizens developed a double morality. In public, they repeated the official slogans, attended party meetings, and clapped at parades. In private, they mocked the system, told jokes about Brezhnev and the bureaucracy, and looked for ways to obtain what the state could not provide. The planned economy kept functioning, but worse and worse each time. Factories produced tractors nobody needed while basic goods were in short supply. State shops had empty shelves or were full of merchandise nobody wanted to buy. People spent hours in endless queues to get meat, decent bread, or a pair of shoes that would not fall apart after the first month. Everyday life in the Soviet Union of the 1960s and 70s was a mixture of routine, shortage, and small victories. Families lived in communal apartments where several generations shared kitchen and bathroom, argued over the use of the stove, and knew every detail of their neighbors' lives. There was no privacy. Wages were low but stable, unemployment practically did not exist, and the state guaranteed free education and healthcare, although the quality of both left much to be desired. Hospitals lacked modern equipment, teachers earned miserable salaries, and universities remained tools of propaganda. Even so, there was a collective pride based on real achievements. The Soviet Union had defeated Hitler, sent the first man into space, and was competing with the United States in the arms race. That pride coexisted with deep frustration because at home everything was missing: varied food, quality clothing, appliances that worked. Soviets knew that people in the West lived better, but propaganda insisted that they lived in the most just system in the world. Nobody fully believed it, yet nobody dared to say so out loud either. The nomenklatura, the party elite, lived in a world apart. They had access to special shops where imported products imported from abroad were sold, enjoyed holidays at exclusive resorts, sent their children to the best schools, and traveled abroad. Corruption spread to the highest levels of government. Officials accepted bribes, diverted public funds, and protected their relatives in positions of power. Brezhnev's daughter, Galina, was known for her scandals, but no one dared touch her. In the Central Asian republics, party bosses behaved like feudal lords, amassing fortunes while their populations lived in poverty. The system was rotting from the inside, yet it kept working because every gear was lubricated with complicity and resignation. Dissidence existed, but it was a minority phenomenon. A few brave individuals, writers, scientists, human rights activists, dared to criticize the regime openly and paid the price. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was expelled from the country in 1974 after his devastating chronicle of the labor camp system, the Gulag Archipelago, was published in the West. Andrei Sakharov, the nuclear physicist who had helped develop the Soviet hydrogen bomb, became a human rights defender and was exiled to Gorky, a city closed to foreigners. The KGB, the secret police, watched dissidents, arrested them, locked them in psychiatric hospitals, or sent them to the Gulag. But terror was no longer massive. Dissidents knew they would be punished, but they also knew they would not disappear into the night without trace, as in Stalin's time. Their texts circulated in samizdat, typewritten copies passed from hand to hand, and some of their works reached the West thanks to journalists and diplomats. Radio Liberty and other Western stations broadcast forbidden news that millions of Soviets listened to in secret. The regime tried to jam the signals, but it never fully succeeded. Information leaked through, slowly but steadily, eroding official propaganda. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and opened a wound that never closed. The government presented the invasion as a fraternal aid mission to a brother country, but it soon turned into a brutal war that consumed resources, lives, and morale. Thousands of young soldiers were sent to fight in hostile mountains against guerrillas who knew the terrain and received support from the West. Coffins returned in secret, families received terse notifications, and the government hid the real figures of dead and wounded. Veterans came home traumatized, addicted to drugs, and many could not reintegrate into society. The war was unpopular, but nobody protested openly. People simply stopped believing in the regime's promises. Afghanistan became the Soviet Vietnam, a war that proved the all-powerful state was not so powerful after all. On the 26th of April of 1986, the Chernobyl disaster occurred. A nuclear reactor exploded in Ukraine, releasing radiation that contaminated vast areas of Europe. For days, the Soviet government tried to hide the scale of the tragedy. They did not evacuate the nearby population immediately, did not warn neighboring countries, and lied about radiation levels. When they finally acknowledged the accident, it was already too late. Hundreds of thousands of people had been exposed, entire cities became uninhabitable, and trust in the state evaporated. Chernobyl symbolized everything that was wrong with the Soviet Union: incompetence, corruption, secrecy, and the willingness to sacrifice human lives to protect the regime's image. The liquidators, the men who cleaned up the radioactive debris, died slowly of cancer while the government gave them medals and sent them home without proper medical care. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, many believed that things could finally improve. He was young, educated, charismatic, and spoke of reforms. He introduced two concepts that would change the Soviet Union forever: perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, informational openness. The idea was to modernize socialism without destroying it, to allow more freedom without losing control, and to revitalize the economy without abandoning central planning. It was a noble attempt, and one doomed to failure. Glasnost allowed the media to speak about the country's problems: corruption, shortages, Stalin's crimes, Brezhnev's mistakes. Newspapers published articles that would have been unthinkable years earlier. Writers recovered banned works, and filmmakers showed movies that had been censored for decades. People began to talk openly about politics, to form civic groups, to protest without fear of immediate arrest. But opening Pandora's box had unforeseen consequences. Once people were allowed to speak, they did not stop. They criticized not only Stalin, but the entire system. They questioned the planned economy, the party's monopoly, and the very legitimacy of the Soviet state. The economic perestroika was a disaster. Gorbachev tried to introduce market mechanisms without dismantling the state economy, and the result was chaos. Companies did not know how to operate in the new system. Inflation soared, state subsidies disappeared, and shops became even emptier than before. People who had survived decades of shortages now faced real hunger. In 1991, the queues for bread in Moscow were longer than during the war. Lifetime savings evaporated with inflation, pensioners sold their belongings on the streets, and crime exploded. The KGB lost power, but criminals gained it. Organized gangs controlled businesses, extorted merchants, and contract killings became commonplace. The state that had promised to protect its citizens could no longer do so. The non-Russian republics took advantage of the opening to demand independence, and in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, separatist feeling was overwhelming. In the Caucasus, Armenians and Azerbaijanis clashed in a war that left thousands dead, while in Ukraine nationalism grew, fueled by historical resentment and the memory of the Stalinist famine. Gorbachev tried to hold the union together through negotiations, but every concession generated new demands that further weakened the state. In August of 1991, a group of hardline communists launched a coup d'etat in an attempt to save the Soviet Union. They failed in 3 days later, ridiculed and drunk, and with their clumsiness they ended up sealing the country's fate for good. Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia, emerged as the hero of the moment, while Gorbachev returned from house arrest transformed into a leader without power. On the 25th of December of 1991, he tendered his resignation, and the red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. marking the end of the Soviet Union. For ordinary citizens, the collapse was a mixture of relief, confusion, and fear. Some celebrated the end of the dictatorship, others mourned the disappearance of the only system they had ever known. Those who had savings lost them, those who had secure jobs found themselves unemployed, those who had believed in communism felt that their entire lives had been a lie, and those who had never believed in anything simply kept surviving as always. Statues of Lenin toppled, streets were renamed, and the anthems fell silent, but the closed factories, the hospitals without medicine, the schools without teachers, and the fear of the future remained. The Soviet Union had died, but its shadow would continue to weigh on Russia for decades. An entire generation learned to live without faith in utopia, looking back among ruins and memories, wondering whether a different ending had ever been possible.